Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm doing part 2 of my discussion of the War of Palestine, edited by Eugene, Rogan, and Avi Shlaim. In the first part of my review, which I would recommend that you actually watch before this review, so if you've somehow landed here, I'll put up a card and you can go back and watch the first review first. It will make this part more coherent, though if you are one to just keep watching the video you're watching, I welcome you to stay. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about the other countries involved in the coalition was fighting against the IDF and why their own internal political struggles, as well as external political rivalries with the other countries in the Arab League, undermined any kind of help they could offer to the Palestinians. And in fact, underlined that while their populations were sympathetic towards the Palestinians, the leadership of these countries really weren't that interested ultimately in helping the Palestinians. And that's why the war was such a colossal failure and such a colossal defeat for the Arabs in 1948. So let's start with Iraq. So the Iraq chapter is written by Charles Tripp, and Tripp does a good job of explaining to us that the Iraqis were dealing with a rise of communism, which they were trying to put down fairly brutally. They were also in the middle of a renegotiation of a peace treaty, military treaty with the British. So they were trying to move quietly along with that because the population would not be too happy with that. And they were in, you could say, a soft alliance with now Jordan, then Transjordan, because they shared the Hashemite lineage in their ruling families. So Iraq is not going to do anything that Transjordan wouldn't want it to do, and their military forces would be detailed to the Arab Legion, which was Abdullah's Transjordanian force. And so Iraq was only going to be a minor player in this, but it's still worth understanding their role. This is the very first paragraph of Tripp's essay. Iraq's role in the 1948 war was ambivalent. Its leaders were the first to advocate coordinated military intervention in Palestine by the armies of the Arab states. Yet its own army, despite being the largest single Arab force in Palestine by the end of the war, did little beyond occupying defensive positions in the hills of the West Bank. Similarly, Iraqi ministers called repeatedly for the imposition of an Arab oil and trade boycott of the Western powers supporting partition, yet did nothing to implement it. During the war itself, Iraq initially rejected all ceasefires, but failed to back this up with more effective military strategies. Following the fighting, the Iraqi government refused to participate in armistice talks and seemed intent simply on withdrawing its troops as rapidly as possible. The events surrounding 1948 illustrate the disjunctures between the rhetorical and the material aspects of Iraqi politics. Radical statements were rarely followed by actions as dramatic or as forceful as the language suggested. Even the deployment of substantial military forces by the Iraqi state can be seen partly as a strategy of control and partly as a theatrical display, rather than as an attempt materially to prevent the establishment of the State of Israel. The ideal of an independent Arab Palestine to which successive Iraqi governments pledged themselves was outweighed in reality by fear of the implications of a Palestinian state dominated by a regime hostile to the Hashemites. This prospect was a powerful influence on the ways in which the resources of the Iraqi state were actually deployed. It was not the only influence at work, but it did much to further the view within Iraq and in the region that the Hashemite dynasty in Iraq and in Transjordan was responsible for the failure of an independent Palestinian state to emerge in 1948. The next essay is by Fawaz Gerges and is about Egypt. Now, Egypt is the country that created the first peace treaty with Israel, as we know, with Sadat. And there are reasons why Egypt decided to go its own way, and part of that may be seen in the resentment that they felt from this war and how they were treated in relation to the Arab League. Now, remember, Egypt is part of the anti-Hashemite coalition, let's say along with Syria and Saudi Arabia. They don't want Abdullah and the Hashemites to become, let's say, a greater power in the region where they're ruling over a large amount of land. Egypt wanted to maintain a power balance. And we would see this happen in Europe. We would see this happen in Asia. The balance of power politics is a unfortunate and deadly game that has been played for centuries. And it was playing out with these new Arab states as well, very suspicious of each other. So Egypt's decision to intervene in the Palestine war was influenced by political and tactical considerations. King Farouk decided to enter the 1948 war against the advice of his prime minister, Mahmoud Nukrashi, the army, and the major political parties. Despite the skepticism of the members of parliament and their questioning of the wisdom of intervention, they, like the king, were influenced by public sentiment and the logic of inter-Arab politics and supported Farouk's decision to enter the war. In fact, one of the major reasons behind Farouk's intervention in the 1948 war was his desire to contain Abdullah and prevent him from gaining further influence and power in the Arab arena. I mean, you're reading this now and it's somewhat unbelievable, but this is how the Palestinians were beaten before they even got a chance to fight. Indeed, Arab politicians listened to the misleading accounts of Azam, Secretary General of the Arab League, and Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Palestine and chair of the Arab Higher Committee. They were both away from Palestine and ignorant of internal conditions there, and overestimated Arab strength, claiming that all the Arabs needed was 3,000 or 4,000 fighters to throw the Jews into the sea. Which, remember, we heard Edward Said in The Question of Palestine talk about growing up in Palestine in the Mandate, and he heard this discussion that, all we're going to need is some sticks. We're going to go and chase the Jews, and we'll run them off into the sea, as if they were not serious fighters. The Palestinians and the Arabs in general vastly underestimated the organization and the commitment of the Jews to fight for this land. And that was a major strategic mistake. And that's to themselves. They could have done the research. They could have found out just how serious the Jews were, or they could have entered into some kind of negotiations with them when they realized how far along the project was. They didn't choose any of those things. And listen to more of the internal bickering. Time and again, Farouk and Abdullah bickered over the size of each other's flag in their territories in Palestine. Farouk complained bitterly to UN mediators that the Jordanian flag in one of the towns controlled by Cairo was a few centimeters larger than the Egyptian flag. Tensions and infighting also marked relations between Egyptian and Jordanian units on the battlefield. Moreover, hardly anything is written about friction and strife between Arab military forces and local Palestinians. For example, Egyptian troops mistreated and mistrusted Palestinians whom they accused of treachery. Conflict between Egyptian units and locals intensified after the former attempted to disarm Palestinian fighters. Egypt would go on to sponsor an all-Palestine government in Gaza. But remember that this isn't necessarily because they care about the Palestinians so much. It's because they don't like Abdullah, and this would be one way to throw some dirt in Abdullah's eye. Its sponsorship of the all-Palestine government, however, had more to do with inter-Arab rivalries and local politics than heightened opposition to Israel. The immediate purpose of the proposed Arab government in Palestine was to provide a focal point of opposition to Abdullah and serve as an instrument for frustrating his ambition to federate the Arab regions of Palestine with Transjordan. All right, moving on. Syria. Now, Syria had won its independence, I want to say in 1956, from the French, and we're very proud of that independence, that they didn't have a colonial master. However, this made them very vulnerable to the Greater Syria project, which was discussed openly. It wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was something that Abdullah wanted. And Syria is thinking, well, we have to defend ourselves from Abdullah. And so as you're moving towards war, and they're expected to contribute an army, their idea is, well, we can't send all of our troops because what happens if our troops get decimated in the war with the Israelis and then we don't have an army to protect ourselves? Abdullah sends his troops in, takes over Syria. And so the army that had been trained near Damascus sat on the border for a long time during that war because the Syrian president wouldn't send in those troops because he wanted to basically maintain a guard against Abdullah. So if you think about it now and you hear it and you hear me articulate it, I couldn't believe it when I read it, but I'm sure you might not even believe it hearing it. But these are the realities of the political situations in 1947, 48, and then 49. For Syria, the danger of King Abdullah's dialogue with the Jewish agency was not so much the likelihood that it would help the Yishuv to become a state, which most believed to be quite small. The real danger was the prospect that it would allow the Hashemites to become the dominant power in the region. From the outset of the war, the primary concern of the Arab states was the inter-Arab conflict. Certainly, all Arab leaders wished they could defeat the Zionists and preserve Palestine for the Arabs. They all made bellicose pronouncements and postured as if it were in their power to defeat the Jews. But they had neither the battle plans nor the ability to do so. From the beginning, the fight was over the balance of power in the region and the future of the Arab world. This was not a war waged to destroy the Jewish state. Again, underlying the myth in Israel that all these Arab armies ganged up against us and they were going to throw us into the sea and poor Israel, and there was only 5 of us. And the reality is the Arabs were fighting among each other. They couldn't possibly mount a real credible attack against the IDF. The IDF had been trained, had obtained illegal weapons, and were, you could say, fighting for their lives. The Arabs were not fighting for their lives. They were just trying to show that they were supporting Little Palestine. The Palestinians were certainly fighting for their lives, but they did not get the support that they deserved from their Arab and, you could say, Muslim brethren. There's so much more I could talk about, but I don't want this review to run as long as part 1 did. The part 1 certainly ran longer than I thought it would, but it was all necessary. I don't regret what I did there. I was going to read a quote about the de-Francocization of the army. The Syrian army was 30,000 strong, had been trained by the French, but the president of Syria realized it had been an army that was built around suppressing Syrian nationalism. And now, could they be trusted to be patriots? He couldn't get it out of his head, so he reduced the army down, reduced morale, took that army down from 30,000 to something like 6,000 serving members, and it was a disaster. But it's not directly related to what I want to talk about, and yet here I didn't read it to you. I explained it to you anyway. On the 5th of April, Abd al-Qadir al-Husseini, the leader of the Palestinian irregulars, the Jihad Muqaddas, who were defending the Jerusalem region, came to Damascus to get help. He begged Quwatli is the name of this Syrian president, and the members of the military committee in charge of the ALA, the Arab Liberation Army, for weapons, artillery, and support. He was refused any assistance because Abd al-Qadir was under the command of Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem and head of the higher Arab executive, which refused to recognize the Arab League's and Quwatli's authority over Palestine. Obviously he wouldn't. Why would he want to necessarily recognize the authority of the outside Arab states over Palestine when he's fighting to preserve Palestine for his own people? As Abd al-Qadir stormed out of the meeting to make his way back to the fighting at Kastel, where he would be killed within days, he screamed in rage at Quwatli and the committee, "You're all traitors, and history will record that you lost Palestine." For Quwatli, retaining control of northern Palestine and protecting Syria's frontier was more important than coming to the defense of Jerusalem. One leading Palestinian officer who fought with the Mufti's forces concludes that the Arab Liberation's army was to wreck the organized resistance of the Jihad Muqaddas, the Mufti's forces, in which the young men of Palestine enlisted. What a damning statement. And that essay was by Joshua Landis about the Syrians. I should have been giving that name as well. The next essay is by Matthew Hughes about the Lebanese. Now, Lebanon was, let's say, in principle, a Christian state, although they had a large Arab, I would even argue majority. There was just a Christian minority at the time. But they had managed to keep a status quo, a deal that they worked with each other and shared power across different parts of the government. And I think it's probably still in place to this day. That's something I'll learn more when I visit Lebanon later this year. I'll talk to the Lebanese and understand their country a bit better. But when you understand that with a Christian ruling class, they did not really want to go to war with Israel. For them, the status quo was fine. They didn't possess some sort of problem with the Israelis for whatever reason. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that that's the status quo. And so the Lebanese government once again had to bow to pressures from their population and needed to show that they were fighting against the Israelis, even though the government didn't really have their heart in it. And so you have basically a symbolic battle that was fought. And just as a note, the Lebanese army was not ready when the war with Israel broke out on the 15th of May, 1948. Its program for reorganization and re-equipment was so backward that in May 1949, 2 months after the war had ended, it was still taking its, quote, first steps towards standardizing, modernizing, and increasing equipment and reorganizing, unquote, so that its soldiers would have new weapons to replace the, quote, miscellaneous small arms used heretofore and lorries to replace horses. So they needed to put up a fight. They did in Malakia, which is a battle that they won, and then they withdrew effectively. One of the writers, one of the people at the time said that it was the equivalent of putting the key into the lock and then not turning the key and linking up with the other armies. Ideally, what the Lebanese government needed was one dignified battle for face-saving purposes against the Israelis that would give its army recognition among the Lebanese population, help assuage inflamed public opinion, and provide a symbolic military success before any peace talks. And you have to realize that the army officer corps was almost entirely Christian. And so the Muslims in Lebanon referred to their army as a Christian army. And so to prevent accusations of favoritism against Israel, the Lebanese Christian-led army needed to attack Israel, but they did so in a very token way. The last essay about the countries comes from Madawi al-Rashid, and it's about Saudi Arabia. And just as a little bit of history, you have to understand that the House of Saud is relatively new in the Game of Thrones in this region of the world, because the Hashemites, as I mentioned already, were in charge of the Hijaz, the holy sites around Mecca, Medina, for centuries. But the Saudis pushed them out, and so they had to be part of the anti-Hashemite coalition, you could say. But they were also slavish to the British, basically just saying, yes, master, no, master. And we have all of these reports. Ibn Saud was quick. Ibn Saud, I guess, would be the great-grandfather of Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince. I'll have to double check. If there are any Saudis watching this, please feel free to correct me in the comment section. I am not as clear of the lineage of the Saudi royal family, but I feel like Ibn Saud would be the grandfather of the current king. And then would that make him the great-grandfather to Mohammed bin MBS? Yeah. Anyway, as I say, I'm happy to be corrected. Ibn Saud was quick to assert his loyalty to the British, unwilling to let the situation in Palestine drive a wedge between him and his European ally. In a report to his superiors at Whitehall, Sir Andrew Ryan claimed in 1932, Ibn Saud sought a rapprochement with His Majesty's government. He was obsessed by suspicion of the Hashemite rulers, and one of his objects was the impossible one of ousting them from the position of special favor accorded to them by His Majesty's government. However, Ibn Saud still sees in His Majesty's government the most important foreign factor in the world about him, and again he sees a rapprochement in a spirit of anxious misgiving. Oh, please don't leave us, England. In 1938, he repeated his pledges of loyalty to Britain to counter rumors allegedly reported to Britain by Syria and Iraq. British officials in Jeddah confronted Ibn Saud with reports that people in the northern town of Al-Jauf had gathered and smuggled weapons to the rebels in Palestine. Ibn Saud dismissed these rumors. Claims that from our soil military equipment was sent to the rebels in Palestine are but rumors whose purpose is to spoil our friendship. Remember, the British are still in charge of the mandate at this time, so they don't really want someone else to support the rebels on either side, one could argue. I would be a liar were I to say to you that I did not want to fight the Jews with every bone in my body, but Britain is the ultimate judge in Palestine, and it is in the interest of the Arabs to remain loyal to Britain. We must confess that we received many requests to help with the revolution in Palestine, but God willing, we will never do anything that undermines our promises to Britain. Even if all Arabs unite, they will never be able to defeat Britain. If this is the case, how could we provide the rebels with military assistance, which will never change this reality? Oh, Master, you're so brave and strong. How could we ever defeat you? Please don't think that we would do this. The British took his comments and sentiments seriously, both in shaping their regional policies and in assessing the political climate. In divide and rule policies played from behind a facade of the neutral arbiter, the British could not have found a better partner than Ibn Saud. For his part, Ibn Saud also played several roles, ranging from the pious imam to the tribal patriarch to the wise and cautious Muslim leader. His alliance with Britain was important for sustaining the balance of power with the Hashemites and the other regional powers, while keeping Saudi Arabia firmly under his rule. He saw Arab unity as another name for regional power struggle in the shadow of Britain. We have an afterword written by Edward Said, who, as you know from my reviews, I admire so much. Can't wait to talk about more of his books with you. But this is just a short afterword that he gives, talking about everything that had happened. I mean, in the Arab case, that the rhetorical and military hostility toward Israel led to more, not less, ignorance about it, and ultimately to the disastrous politico-military performances of the 1960s and 1970s. The cult of the army, which implied that there were only military solutions to political problems, was so prevalent that it overshadowed the axiom that successful military action had to derive from a motivated, bravely led, and politically integrated and educated force, and this could only issue from a citizen society. Such a desideratum was never the case in the Arab world, and was rarely practiced or articulated. In addition, a nationalist culture was consolidated that encouraged, rather than mitigated, Arab isolation from the rest of the modern world. Israel was soon perceived not only as a Jewish, but as a Western state, and as such was completely rejected even as a suitable intellectual pursuit for those who were interested in finding out about the enemy. So more ignorance piled on top of the ignorance that got them defeated in 1948 in the first place. And when he's asked, how do we solve this problem, Said always points to the fact that we have to understand our history and we have to figure out what happened back then in order to figure out what we're going to do now. And yet, they could not be in the position they are in without that entirely concrete and minutely, intensely lived experience of loss and dispossession for which 1948 is both origin and enduring symbol. So there is an eerie dynamic by which the reliving of our mistakes and disasters comes forward collectively without the force or the lessons or even the recollection of our past. We are perpetually at the starting point, looking for a solution now, even as that now itself bears all the marks of our historical diminishment and human suffering. So I hope you enjoyed this part 2. If you haven't seen part 1, I would encourage you to go back and look at part 1. This is my part of my journey, particularly in this part of the year as I'm doing these historical reviews, to make sure that I understand everything that happened around 1948 so that I can move forward. If I don't understand 1948 down to a granular level, I don't think that I can really understand everything that comes after. And that's why I'm spending the time now to really dig in and understand not just what was happening in Palestine, but what was happening in all the countries around it. And this, for the number of pages we're talking about, it's under 300 pages, heavily footnoted with all sorts of wonderful books. You know, all of the references give you more rabbit holes that you can go down. So in terms of, let's say, pound for pound, this is a book that I would really recommend because it gives you so much information in such a small number of pages. And then also it serves as a resource for you to dig even deeper. If you'd like to share this with someone, please do. Hit like, hit subscribe, consider sending a super thanks, consider joining my Patreon, my YouTube members. That's a way for you to get early access to these videos, but also contribute to me financially, help the channel grow. And also indirectly in 2024, you'll also help support the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. There'll be a link there if you want to support them directly and help children in Palestine who could not otherwise receive medical care. Also consider picking something from my Amazon wish list to send my way to review. And that way I might be able to review that book in the future. Until then, and as always, enjoy your reading.